Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to try and answer the question about whether when you've played and finished one or more of the new modern ReEngine Resident Evil games, such as the Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 remakes, and Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 Village, which of the older titles that came out before that should you consider going back and playing? Which games are worth your financial, but more importantly, your time investment? And I think my answer, my conclusion, could be quite controversial to some. Now, I'm only going to be talking about the Resident Evil games which are easily available to play on PlayStation, Xbox and PC, and unfortunately that doesn't include the original Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, so I'm not considering them in this video. Also, to understand my point of view and where I'm coming from and whether that could be relevant to you, I should explain my relationship with the Resident Evil franchise. My first Resident Evil was Resident Evil 2 when it originally came out on the N64 back in 1999. Then I played Nemesis and Code Veronica on the PS2. I think Nemesis with backwards compatibility. A couple of years later when I picked up the PS2, and that was it for me for Resident Evil. Didn't play any of the Survivors or the Outbreaks or the light gun games or anything like that. And then I kind of had a hiatus from video games as a whole until late into the Xbox 360 era. And even then I wasn't really interested in playing Resident Evil single player games. If you'd asked me though, said, well, of the ones you played, what was your favourite? I would probably say that it was Nemesis, Resident Evil 3, and the reason for that would be because of at the time thinking about it, obviously when you look at the graphics now, you know, they're not that special, but the pre-rendered graphics of Resident Evil 2 and Nemesis, I can still remember kind of plugging Resident Evil 2 into my N64, turning it on and starting to play it and going, oh my god, this looks so good, looks better than anything we'd had before. And obviously the atmosphere was really good in those games. The problem, you see, was that I was relearning playing video games, and Call of Duty and Call of Duty multiplayer was my passion. So I kind of played a lot of Call of Duty, played a lot of Battlefield, played a lot of PUBG, and sort of moved eventually on to DayZ as well. Mainly on console and recently on PC. And so hardware-wise, I worked my way through the PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series S, and now, you know, a gaming PC as well. Now, when I had the PS4, I did pick up the PSVR. So, of course, Resident Evil 7 was one of the flagship titles for that. And playing Resident Evil 7 in virtual reality was amazing. I actually got to demo it at a Gamescom somewhere in the UK. I can't remember which one, but before the game came out. And I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. And the experience was like nothing else that, you know, I'd had before. It was so scary. However, the problem with the PSVR was that I always found it a bit sweaty. You know, unless you were playing in somewhere that had air conditioning, after a while you're like, oh, this is a bit much. So I did finish the game in normal flat mode, and although I thought it was a great game, I still wasn't really seriously pulled back in the franchise. I didn't really think, all right, let's play all the rest of them now at all. So I carried on playing like DayZ and PUBG and Call of Duty and Battlefield and all that sort of stuff as my main games. And then after the Resident Evil 2 remake came out and eventually it went on sale, I bought it on the PlayStation 4, and I've got to say, it really blew me away. I can still just turn on that game now, and just walking through the Raccoon City Police Department with the sound of the footsteps and the ambient sound that's going on, all the attention to detail, not only had the nostalgia coming through from playing the original games and kind of recognising statues and areas and puzzles and stuff like that, but it was just a really great video game as well. And I played through it and I thought, yeah, this is really good. Sometimes I felt it was a little bit long, especially if you're playing like on a PlayStation. And I would recommend actually now, you know, like as a bonus tip to say is, don't be scared to play any of these games on easy mode, because when you are playing them on the harder modes, they can get a bit frustrating when you're playing for a long time. However, even then, when I got that, I still wasn't like, right, let's go back and play all the Resident Evil games I've missed. So then I was lucky enough to get my gaming PC, and I got the Raccoon City bundle of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. So I straight away played Resident Evil 3, and really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed that. And then fired up Resident Evil 2 Remake and really enjoyed playing that again on the PC. And obviously the beauty with the PC is the graphics tend to be a little bit better, and you can have like trainers, you can have cheats on as well for getting through the game really quickly. And at this time, I guess this is probably when Resident Evil really started to get into its claws into me with PC. So I repurchased Resident Evil 7 and got the gold edition, so it had all the extra DLCs. I never had that on PlayStation 4. And I played a little bit of that, and I was like, alright, this is amazing. And then the Resident Evil 4 remake came out back in March. I'm recording this video in June 2023, and I was like, I bought the deluxe edition version, on day one for PC. And I must admit, one of the cool things about PC is that you can go to key sites and buy stuff cheaper. So although I bought the deluxe edition, I think it was £40. So it's much cheaper than when you're buying them on console. And I thoroughly enjoyed the Resident Evil 4 remake. I thought it was really good. So much so that as soon as I finished it, I then got the gold edition of Resident Evil 8, Resident Evil Village, and played through all the way through that, including the Rose DLC. And, so right now, if you'd ask me which is my favourite Resident Evil game now, it would be a tie between Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil Village. I really think that Resident Evil 8 or Resident Evil Village is an amazing game, and it has aspects from all of the remakes and all of Resident Evil, I think, to appeal to people who like, survival horror and more of the action stuff. Now, I think that the Resident Evil 2 remake is a better Resident Evil game because it's kind of based, I always feel a bit silly saying this, but it's based in reality, whereas Resident Evil Village brings in more of the fantasy style of things, with vampires and werewolves and things like that. But I do think that Village is a better overall video game as well. So I think a tie would be the fairest option. So maybe, after all that, you've reached that point too. You've finished the modern ReEngine titles, and you look at the older games on Steam, you see them go on sale or in the PlayStation or Xbox stores, and you're thinking, oh, I want to experience more of this. I've enjoyed it so much. I want to see what the RE universe has to offer. And, which games are worth playing? Unfortunately, the answer, is my opinion, is not actually that many. Okay, so I'm really sorry about this, because having played the original RE4 and RE5 and RE6 and the Revelation games, I found that unless you're a die-hard fan and you really haven't got any other games to play, these older games just aren't as fun, and they don't have the level of immersion, and they don't have the graphics aren't as good as obviously as the later games, but kind of also of the earlier games as well, because the problem is that these games, 4, 5, 6 and Revelation, that they have the over-the-shoulder viewpoint camera and the gunplay. And I think it's just too early in the life cycle of that style of game, because it just hasn't been fine-tuned enough in these titles. And I'm not knocking them for this, because you've got to remember that RE4 came out in 2005. It was a game changer in the games industry for the third-person over-the-shoulder view. And the last game we're talking about, sort of Revelations 2, was the last of the old engine Resident Evil titles, which came out in 2015. And the way that games have changed over that period is enormous. That the way that the controls work and the camera works, it's taken us an awful long time to get to a point where we are now, where over-the-shoulder third person, or first person to be honest, it kind of works in a way that is really cool and works very, very well. And so, the quality of life and the smoothness of controls and the way that the gunplay is now just isn't there in the old games, and it can be very frustrating. And the problem is that this isn't made up with things like the graphical fidelity or the storylines in this game, in my opinion. All these early games definitely look like they're from the Xbox 360 or the PS3 area. They have that look, and there's no doubt that over this period, Resident Evil kind of had lost its way in terms of what it wanted to be. I mean, arguably, I know people say that Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest video games of all time. It might be. I find it too difficult to play with the tank controls. And I think the Resident Evil 4 remake obviously is way better than me. Way better for me, sorry. And I think it's kind of widely agreed that Resident Evil 6 is probably one of the worst Resident Evil games. And it wasn't really until Resident Evil 7, when the new ReEngine came out, that the series kind of did almost like a mini reboot, returned to its roots, and regained its reputation, not only for being a great survival horror game, but for being really good video games, full stop. So, my advice is, don't waste your time or money on the original RE4, 5 or 6 or the 2 Revelation games. Watch the cutscenes or on YouTube, or read about them on Wikipedia so you know the stories. Let's wait for them to be remade in the ReEngine, and they'll be so much better. In the meantime, though, go back and play all the DLC for the latest games. I mean, if you haven't played the Rose story for Resident Evil Village, you are missing out on probably the best bit of the entire game. Maybe play these games on harder difficulty levels, because there's so much more content in Resident Evil games than we'd expect, and they are specifically designed for repeated playthroughs as well. So you should always do that. However, there is time for a twist, Resident Evil style, in the tail of this video, because there are a couple of old RE games that are easily available on all platforms that are worth playing, and that is the Resident Evil HD remake of the original game and the Resident Evil 0 HD game as well. Now, these two, they're both in the original fixed camera perspective. And they've got good, and in the case of 0, sometimes really great looking pre-rendered backgrounds and 3D player characters, like the original Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. But obviously they've been remade, and had a HD makeover, with 0 having a much more significant HD kind of upgrade than the Resident Evil HD remake. And it's not that these games don't have their gameplay and quality of life challenges. You'll be playing them and it won't be obvious what to do, and sometimes, especially in the Resident Evil HD remake, the pre-rendered backgrounds in your character look a bit dodgy. All this looks a bit crap. But I think because they're actually fixed camera and not over the shoulder third person, I think it's actually easier to get used to that different way of controlling the player than the style in Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6 and Revelations, because it's completely different, and you're not kind of that muscle memory you've got from playing like The Division or PUBG or DayZ or anything like that isn't there, because you're controlling the character in a totally different way. You don't have the dodgy camera and over the shoulder aiming problems you get with those titles. And I think with the fixed camera angles, you can appreciate Resident Evil's horror B-movie roots, because there's plenty of Dutch angles and blind corners to ratchet up the tension. And it takes you back, and it reminds you of the different way in which the original Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 2 and Nemesis, where most of us came into the title, how they ratcheted the tension by the fact that you couldn't see round corners because of the camera angle, but maybe you could hear a zombie there or a monster there. Now, Resident Evil 0 definitely looks better than Resident Evil Remake HD, but it's arguable that the Resident Evil remake of the original game is a better game. And having played it all the way through, I've got to kind of say that, the template that it creates sets the template for all the great Resident Evils to follow. Where you explore, you can't get through a door, you explore, you find a key, and then you go through that door and there's a puzzle, you've got to solve the puzzle, you go through another door, and you're going backwards and forwards, taking in the environment and the atmosphere, and gradually your play area gets bigger, and then you go on to a next area and it kind of starts again. Now, I'd still recommend playing both of these with a guide, because what we also tend to forget is back in the day, like when I was playing the original Resident Evil 2 on my N64, I guarantee I would have had a magazine with a guide telling me how to play it next to me as I was playing it, because they don't have that many hints and tips, and it's very easy to get stuck, and it's not always obvious what you should be doing, in a way that modern games now are much better at signposting us, not in a completely obvious way, with like an icon on the screen saying go here and do this, but with more subtle guides and stuff like that. So I'd definitely say use it with a guide, and to be honest, I also wouldn't think any less of anybody for using a cheat trainer if you're on PC, so you have like infinite ammo or you have invincibility. Because you're really just playing through the games, I think, for the experience the first time and to experience the story. And then if you think, oh yeah, that was really good, that's my cup of tea, by all means then turn off all the aids, put the guide away, and then play it through manually afterwards. So there we go. In my opinion, Once you've finished the new ReEngine RE titles and the DLC and the extra modes, don't bother with the older over-the-shoulder games. Just go for the fixed camera Resident Evil 0 HD and the original Resident Evil Remake HD, and you won't be sorry. What do you think though? Am I completely mad? Is this something you're going to do? Is this something that you've done? Have you played the original RE4, 5 and 6s, got used to the controls and the camera and thoroughly enjoyed them? Put your questions and comments down below. If you've enjoyed the video, hit like. If you want to see more of the same, press subscribe, and I will of course see you again soon.